So I'm going to show you how to do some stem stitch lettering today. So a lot of people have asked about this after I posted the pictures of the pieces where I do stem stitch lettering. Stem stitch is my absolute favorite stitch ever because it's so versatile, or I think it is anyway. So most people would use stem stitch just for kind of line work for basically the stems of flowers and stuff. But I think it's really nice as a filling stitch as well. So I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to do this in two parts. So I'm going to do the first part is going to be just how I do a stem stitch, because I know there are slight variations on it. So the first part, this video, is just going to be doing these lines in stem stitch. So that's just how I do a normal stem stitch. And then the second part is going to be how I use stem stitch as a filling stitch to fill up these other spaces here. So yeah, I suppose let's get started. If you haven't seen my videos before, there are loads of videos on my website about how to get started. So you do want your fabric to be quite tight in the hoop. I mean, you can probably see there that's tight like a drum. So I find that quite helpful with this stem stitch. Maybe it's just me, maybe because I pull my threads quite tight. But you do want your fabric nice and tight anyway. So if you're not sure what I'm doing here with my stab stitches, that's just how I start off with all my stitches. So there is a tutorial on that on my website as well. So check those out if you're not sure what exactly I'm doing there. So stem stitch, we're working from the top of the line all the way down, just a straight stem stitch line. So I'm coming up at the very beginning of that line and I'm going down just a little bit further on. I'm going to come the other side of that stab stitch there. So you only want a couple of millimeters for your stitch, and that's going to be your stitch size now. Okay, so that's going to be the size of all of your stitches. All right, so you're going to keep that thread to one side. I'm going to keep it on the left hand side here. I'll explain which side you keep it on in a sec. I don't want to give you too much all at once. So I've come up and gone back down, and I'm keeping this loop of thread over to the left. And then I'm going to come up on that line again at the halfway point. So between where I came up and where I went back down, I'm coming up in the halfway point. And then just pulling that nice and tight. And again, I'm going to keep my thread over to the left. And now my thread is coming up from this point. So I want the same distance of a stitch. So from, let's see if I can, the distance from here to here, that first stitch, is the same as the difference from that halfway point to where I put my needle in next. Okay, so your stitches are kind of overlapping, if that makes sense. Okay, so you're coming down a little bit further along the line, again keeping that loop of thread, and you're going to come up at the new halfway point, which should meet the previous stitch. Okay, so if your stitches are nice and even, that should meet the previous stitch. You're coming up in the same hole that that stitch is in. All right. And again, just pulling tight. And we're just going to continue with that. Again, coming a little bit further down the line, keeping your thread over to the left and up at the halfway point, but also at the previous stitch. And I'm just going to get that knot out of the way. So again, a little bit further down and up at the previous stitch. You want to pull nice and tight. So for this part of the lettering, you can do this stitch for any sort of lettering or in any other way that you want to. But for this lettering, I'm just using 2 strands of normal cotton, stranded cotton floss, whatever you call it, normal embroidery thread. So 2 strands I have here. Of course, you can use as many strands as you want. You don't have to go by what I'm doing, but this is how I do this kind of old English lettering. For most of my lettering, the fonts I use are just kind of fonts that you'd find in Microsoft Word or kind of free things you might come across online on Pinterest and stuff. I quite often kind of mix and match my fonts. So I might take like the capital letter from one font and the lowercase from a different font and match them together and see how they go. Right, so we're getting to the end of this here. So on your last one, to get in to the last stitch as normal, but instead of keeping that loop of thread, you just go right down in the end. Okay, that's how you finish it off. Fairly simple. And that is how you do a normal stem stitch. So I'm just going to fill in these other 2 lines. Now, I mentioned earlier that I always keep my thread on the left, okay? And that's the left. So if I'm working towards me, maybe if I zoom out a bit, if I'm working towards myself, I'm keeping my thread to the left. If I'm working away from myself, I'm keeping my thread to the right. Okay, and the easiest way to remember that is to remember the words upright. Okay, so this, if you're working up away from yourself, you keep your thread to the right. Up, right. Okay. If you're working down, working away from yourself, you keep your thread on the left. Working towards yourself. Did I say that right? I think I might have confused you there. So it's just so that's based on the direction of you rather than the direction of your design. Okay, so if I'm working down towards myself on the left, up away from myself to the right. And that's the same whether my design is facing this way or whether my design is facing that way. Okay, it's stitching in relation to yourself rather than in relation to the design. And that just means that if you do a line here and you also do a straight line over here, that they're kind of facing the same way. whether you're stitching them facing like that or facing like that. Okay, it just helps you to keep your stitching regular, I guess. Just gonna get in nice and close to that other line of stitching there. And don't forget to turn your piece around to suit you, to whatever way is comfortable for you, because that's really what frames and hoops are there to help you with, to find the most comfortable way of stitching. Okay, so that's my simple line work done. So I'm just going to do some stop stitches over here to finish off. And I'll come back to you with part 2, where we go over how to use stem stitch as a filling stitch. So step 1 done. Make sure you practice your stem stitch loads before really getting into using it as a filler, because it is a little bit trickier. It's not too bad, but I would be comfortable doing a stem stitch like this before you go into using it as a filling. All right, so I'll come back to you with part 2 very soon.